We're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapters 13 and 14 tonight. If you're not already over there, you can turn over there. Chapter 13, probably one of the most well-known chapters in the book of 1 Corinthians, often called the chapter of love. But we're going to deal mainly, we'll talk about that a little bit, we're going to deal mainly with chapter 14. And the reason being, I think I mentioned at least last week, if not a couple weeks ago, when we started talking about chapters 12 through 14, they really deal with the idea of spiritual gifts. And particularly chapter 14 deals with the idea of using those gifts within the Lord's church in an orderly and a decent fashion. And so question number one kind of deals with that subject, and the question is this: why is it important to be organized whenever you have a job or a task to complete? Is it important to be organized? Let's ask that. Let's start with that.
Makes your task a lot easier.
Okay. It is important to be organized, isn't it? When you have a job or you have a goal or something you want to accomplish. And why is that the case? Laney said it makes it easier.
Also, it makes the outcome a lot more like you want it to be.
Yeah, it makes what you want to accomplish possible, doesn't it? Because you think about it in any area of life. Just for instance, let's just take the idea of building a house. Okay, so let's just say one day 5 guys decide they're going to build a house. They get together. Well, one starts building one wall, the other starts building another wall. Who's going to bring the lumber? What kind of lumber are we going to use? What kind of insulation are we going to use? Some guy shows up and he said, well, I brought metal for the roofing. I thought that would be best. And the other guy said, well, I brought some shingles to finish it out with. Any task, if you want to accomplish a goal or a purpose, there has to be organization, doesn't there? Is that true in the church?
Yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of times why certain congregations don't accomplish what they want to accomplish is because there's no organization. And of course that starts with leadership, doesn't it? But just because you have leadership doesn't necessarily mean you have organization. And so it's important within the church, and even think about it from this perspective, because that's really what chapter 14 deals with. Is it important to be organized when it comes to a worship service? Yeah, it's essential, isn't it? You got to have an idea of what's going on and who's going to be doing what. And I know Will and Lanny, they deal a lot with that headache when it comes to lining up, making sure that everybody is here and they know what their part is within the worship service. But if we didn't have it organized, what would it be like? Nobody would know what's going on, would they? Who's going to pray? Who's going to lead singing? What songs are we going to sing? Who's supposed to speak? All those things involve the idea of being organized. And so what we learn about here in chapter 14 is the state of the worship service of the church at Corinth was disorganization. And so Paul's writing about that and how they were using these spiritual gifts in an improper way and what they needed to do to kind of correct that. So when we get over to chapter 14, that's going to be mainly what we deal with. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about chapter 13. Again, I made mention of the fact that this is, it's often known commonly as the chapter of love. But Paul talks a lot about love within this chapter itself, and particularly how the Christian, everything that we do, needs to be motivated by love itself. And if it's not, question number 2 here on your handout, if a person in that day and age was speaking in tongues, or if they had faith, or they were a very generous individual, or even if they died for the cause of Christ, what would make all those things meaningless? Yeah, it's if you do it without love. And so think about the importance of love. What are, without love, we are, the things that we do for God are meaningless, aren't they? There's no value to them. And basically what Paul talks about there in that chapter is if we're not doing those things in love, then we're useless to God, aren't we? Because it doesn't mean one thing to Him if we're not doing it out of motivation and the manner of love. You know, I was kind of thinking about that idea. I think that's one of the things especially when I was younger, that I struggled with when thinking about, how much love is emphasized in the pages of the Bible. But if you were to ask the question today, or think about the question today, what is the one thing that the world needs the most of, that would help improve the world the most today? Would it be love? Think about us as Christians in the Lord's church today. What's the one thing that would help us the most, when it comes to our service to God, or helping our fellow man, or doing anything that God commands us to do? It's love, isn't it? And so Paul's emphasizing it. Without love, all these things, no matter what you would do, it would simply be meaningless to God. But if the world really loved each other, and if we as Christians and the Lord's church today, if we really love each other, there's a lot of good that can be done, isn't there? And a lot of great things that could be accomplished. And not only that, what happens to problems? They're resolved, aren't they? And they go away very quickly. So Paul talks about how this is the most excellent way, for a person to live their life, motivated by love. And that's true. I mean, there's no greater motivation that we can have than love for God or love for our fellow men. And so you look at the church at Corinth, what state was the church in?
Disorganization.
It was rough, wasn't it? Probably one of when I think about the early churches, probably one of the congregations that could stand to improve the most would have been the church at Corinth. But Paul writes about, the most excellent way that you guys can live, the way that you can take care of all these things, is be motivated by love. And if you're not motivated by love, then it doesn't matter what you're doing here. It's not going to help, and of course God's not going to find it of any value to Him too. So he talks about love in there in chapter 13. There's kind of I don't know, for lack of a better terms, kind of a list here of traits or qualities, characteristics that love displays. Any of those in verses 4 through 8? Well, what are some of them? Just kind of look through there and maybe pick you one out and bring it up, and maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about it. One you think that's really important there.
Charity.
Okay, yeah, charity is another word for love, but what are the traits or the characteristics there?
It's patient. Suffer long.
Okay, so love, the first one right there in the list. Love suffers long. What does that mean?
Patient would be another word for it.
Yeah, it's patient. It's patience in trials and tribulations. It's patient toward fellow men and, problems that might arise. You think about those in our lives. Well, maybe that's not a good example. Those in our lives with whom we should be the most patient are who?
Family.
Those you love the most, right? Because if you really love a person, you're going to be a lot more understanding and patient with that individual. And I think we see it a lot, or we should see it a lot in our children, don't we? When you're teaching your child to do something versus teaching somebody else, you probably have a lot more patience with your own child than you would with another stranger, so to speak. And it's just generally because of our feelings toward them and the fact that we love them, we care about them. And so if we love other people, we're going to be long suffering. We're going to suffer a long time with them. We're going to be patient with them. What else? Anything else in there stands out to you?
Not jealous.
Okay, not jealous. Yeah, that's a good one for the society in which we live today, isn't it? Because a lot of individuals today, they're jealous of what other people have. They're jealous of their accomplishments. They're jealous of their lifestyle or their possessions even. And even the talents and the gifts and the abilities or physical traits that they possess within their life. So love doesn't look at a person and say, I wish I had what they had, or I'll take it at any means. in order to get it. I'll do anything to them in order to get it from them. But love rejoices in victories, doesn't it? It rejoices in things that are good. Something good happens to somebody else. Somebody's blessed with a prosperous life. They're blessed with a good job or a home, or even or lots of possessions. Anything in this life, they're just happy for them. And again, if that was our view of the world's view and even the church's view toward one another, a lot of things would take care of themselves. Any others in there that think really pop out?
Endures all things, and love never fails.
Yeah, endures all things. So, basically tells us love never quits. True love never quits. Doesn't matter. And this is one of those where we could spend a lot of time on just the word itself in the original language. Probably everybody's heard it before. We already know it, but it's the word that's in the Greek language, the word agape. And love is one of those words. In our English language, we basically have one word for love. Greeks had 4 different words. And I think I've told this story before, but I remember when I went to preaching school, we had a student that came over from Russia. And of course, a lot of these guys who would come over to preaching school there in Memphis, they weren't well versed in English and the English language, and so they had to kind of learn the English language. They knew some of it, but they had to kind of pick up on things as they went. And I'll never forget, one day we were talking about I don't remember what kind of pie we were talking about, but we were talking about pie. And one of the students made the statement, he said, "I love that kind of pie." And boy, that guy's eyes got real big, and we didn't find out till later. He told us, that word in Russian, it means a lot different than what we think of today. So his idea of loving that pie wasn't the same as what this guy was talking about when he was talking about loving that pie. But generally speaking, we kind of have just one cover-all word in the English language for the word love. Greeks had 4 different types of words. And the word that's used here is the word agape, and it basically means it's a word or a kind of love it's not dependent upon the state of that individual. And so, in other words, it doesn't, agape love, you didn't agape love somebody because how much money they had, or because they were related to you, or because they treated you good. It's not dependent upon what that person says or what they do or even their lifestyle itself. It's just a desire for the best that can happen to that person. That's what you want to happen to them, no matter what. And so when you think about love enduring all things, if that was our attitude, regardless of what people said to us or what they did to us or even the type of life that they've lived, it would change the world in a major way. Of course, impacts the church in a major way too. So yeah, enduring all things. What was the second thing you said there, Will?
Never fails.
Never fails. Yeah. So what do you think that means?
You don't just have it for a little while to take care of the things that's going on right now.
That's right. It's 24/7, isn't it? It continues on no matter what happens. And so it never fails. When agape love isn't something that starts one minute and ends the next. It's this continuous process that goes throughout an entire day. So, you look through there, there's tons of great traits and qualities that are mentioned about love there, but this is the type of love that Paul's writing about. He also talks about, kind of in the context, remember we're dealing in the middle here of chapters 12 and 14, the idea of spiritual gifts. But he talks about knowledge, and he talks about prophecy and tongues passing away. And why is that the case? Why does Paul say that these spiritual gifts that had been given to some of these Christians are going to pass away?
Well, there was something perfect to come, complete, instead of part.
Yeah, so Paul emphasizes this idea here in chapter 13. Spiritual gifts weren't part of God's permanent plan for the church, were they? God didn't intend for the church to just keep on having these gifts throughout its duration here upon this earth. And so he emphasizes the idea, listen, these things are going to go away. You know, you guys are fighting about these things, you're ranking each other in order to these things, and one of these days, these things aren't going to be here anymore. They're going to be gone. And so it was, like Gary said, it was an impart system. And what we have to understand about an impart system, it wasn't that you only knew part of the truth. Was the whole truth of God revealed to the early church? Did they know the whole truth?
No. Don't think so. They knew what they needed to know.
Okay, so what did they need to know? Let's ask that.
Well, they needed to know what was going to happen in the future, how the New Testament was going to take care of what was going on in the Old Testament, and it was going to be a perfect kind of situation to arise, and other countless things that they weren't aware of.
Okay, so there's obviously some future prophecies that are given, like in the book of Revelation. I guess I should have worded the question a little bit better. Did they know what they needed to do to get to heaven?
Yes.
Was that completely revealed? Yeah. Yeah. And so what does it mean, an impart system? What does that mean? Paul talks about there, we know in part and we prophesy in part, verse 9.
Different people were able to contribute to that, the whole, and not any one was able to contribute all of it. Some of them prophesied, some of them spoke in tongues, some of them interpreted. It was all, they did this part and that part.
Yeah. And that's really the point that I think we need to get from this impart system. A lot of times people think of it as being incomplete. And I know there's a sense in which it was incomplete, but as far as what they needed to know to be saved, that was all there, wasn't it? And the impart idea is like Gary said, part of it was over here. I mean, you had part of it over here, another guy had part of it here, another guy had this part, and everybody had parts. You had bits and pieces of it throughout the church. Did you have the whole truth? Yeah. But it was in an impart system. And what God's plan was for everybody to have a complete book. The whole truth. Every person, could hold that in their hand. There was a process that God went through to accomplish that, wasn't it? The writing of the New Testament. So until that could be accomplished, until it could be a perfect and complete system, God implemented this impart system in the early church. And again, Paul's emphasizing that this impart system isn't going to last forever. Prophecies are going to fail, tongues are going to cease, knowledge is going to vanish away. So he likens it to the idea of children playing with toys. That's kind of the spiritual gifts of the first century church. It was an imperfect provision that God provided that he intended to amend and change sometime in the future. So question number 5 is this. Paul illustrates it in this way, the difference between being a child and being an adult. And there's probably some adults that might be exceptions to this rule, but how are adults and children different from one another?
Basically reasoning.
Okay, so your understanding increases, or should at least, I guess, as we get older, right? Would you generally say that you know more now than you knew when you were 5 years old? Or at least you forgot more, huh? Knowledge changes, understanding changes. Do the things that are important to us in life change? Some of them, yeah. Do the toys we play with change? Yeah, they're bigger and more expensive. That's right. When you get older, that's the difference. You still have toys. They're just bigger and more expensive. But, you don't play with the same things that you played with when you were a child, do you? Do you use the same speech? No, your speech matures, doesn't it? It develops. And so Paul talks about that change from a child to an adult, how, you have a change in speech, you have a change in behavior, you have a change in the things or the toys, I guess, that you play with. And so the point that he's making is change comes with maturity. And that's true with the early church too. Right now, they're in an immature state. It's just beginning. The church is just starting here. They're kind of in their infancy stage. And so God implements these things for them in their infancy stage. But as they mature, things are going to change, aren't they? And so Paul talks about that idea. And question number 6 here, the last one here in chapter 13, why is love the greatest gift of all? It's talked about all these spiritual gifts, but what's the greatest? Love, why?
Be there when all the rest of them are doing.
Yeah, it's because of the role that love plays in our lives in the future, right? Sometimes, we think about, or maybe it's just me, I think about what's going to happen in the coming days. And, not necessarily life here upon earth, but life after this earth. What does God have prepared for us? What does he have in store for us? What are we going to do while we're serving him in heaven? And the Bible doesn't really give us all those specific details, but it does say this: love is going to be the centerpiece, isn't it? And so that's why love is so important. It doesn't matter. It's going to go far. Our love for God goes far beyond this world. It's something that's going to carry it into the next world and affect our service toward God there. So love is, like Paul said here, love is the greatest of all. Spiritual gifts were going to end. They were going to pass away. The impart system was going to be taken away, but they were still going to need love. So, very important chapter here, kind of right in the middle of this discussion. Well, let's go over to chapter 14. I didn't intend to spend that much time in chapter 13, but let's go over to chapter 14 here, and we'll talk a little bit about these spiritual gifts, and particularly the two gifts that he talks about the most here in this chapter are the gifts of tongues and the gift of prophecy. And one of the things that, I think it might be important just to point out, I know that probably everybody understands this, but when the Bible talks about speaking in tongues, what's it talking about? Languages of men, right? And particularly when we think about, in the religious world today, a lot of people have this idea that speaking in tongues is what they would call the language of God. In other words, their idea, their concept of speaking in tongues is God has this language that he speaks, and the angels speak this language. And when you speak in tongues, it's a person speaking the language that God and the angels speak. And of course, the only way that you can do that is to be moved by the Holy Spirit to do so. So what we want to emphasize is there's probably the easiest passage, at least for me. You may know of one better, but for me to show this and to understand it, first of all, for ourselves, and then to be able to show other people, is Acts chapter 2. So turn over to Acts chapter 2 real quickly here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I do just want to mention a couple verses here. If you're talking to somebody and you're talking about, the speaking in tongues, this is a good place to take them and show them what the Bible means when you're talking about speaking in tongues. But in Acts chapter 2, of course, the context is the day of Pentecost. You have the apostles there, and we have the Holy Spirit descending upon each one of them. And if you go down to verse 4, it says, they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. So you have the apostles on the day of Pentecost speaking in other tongues. And if you go down to verse 6, you'll find out what this meant. It says, and when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused because everyone heard them speak in his own language. Okay, so when they were speaking in tongues, they were speaking in other languages of men, weren't they? Not some language that God and the angels use that nobody else understands, but that's what men were hearing. They say, we're hearing our own language. We're hearing our own tongue. And again, you can go through verse 8. It says, how is it that we hear each other, or hear each in our own language in which we were born? And then it kind of gives a list. So they're saying this is our native language that we're hearing here. The language in which we were born. And then again in verse 11, it says, we hear them speak in our own tongues the wonderful works of God. So when the apostles on the day of Pentecost spoke with other tongues, it simply means they spoke in other languages of men. So they were speaking all these different types of languages of men here. Men were hearing their native tongues, their native languages, and they understood what was said. They didn't need somebody to interpret for them, did they? The miracle of that was this. The apostles themselves didn't know that language. Okay, they had never sat down and studied that language and had a working knowledge of it, but the Holy Spirit empowered them, gave them the ability to speak that language having never studied it before. So when you talk about speaking in tongues, that's what the Bible means when we read about speaking in tongues. When the early church spoke in tongues, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about men didn't have to study foreign languages, but they were given the miraculous ability by the Holy Spirit to speak in another language, a language of man that was not their native language. Why would that be important for the early church? How are you going to teach all nations if you can't speak their language, right?
I mean, just imagine if it was able to do that today.
Yeah. There's a tremendous advantage. If you ever do any work, in another country, there's a tremendous advantage that you have in being able to speak the language of the land. Saves a lot of time, saves a lot of confusion too. But it's very profitable for a person to be able to do that. And it was necessary. The early church had to have these gifts in order to teach all nations. They couldn't speak the language. How are they going to teach all these other people? So it was a miraculous gift of the first century. And when we read about the gift of tongues or speaking in tongues, that's what we're reading about here. So having said that, as you look through chapter 14, go ahead, Daryl. You got a comment?
Well, just a little bit of question here. Verse 28 says, if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in church, let him speak to himself and to God. An interpreter would mean, to me, interpret into the language that, people can understand.
Yeah.
So you're saying he's speaking in foreign language, so what's the purpose there?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that he talks about through the chapter, right? You don't have somebody to interpret to others. Well, let's just do this. What does chapter 14 say? What was the purpose of tongues? Can you find the verse in there?
Is it 22?
Yeah. So go ahead and read that for us, Gary.
Wherefore tongues are for a sign, not to them that believe, but to them that believe not. But prophesying serveth not for them that believe not, but for them which believe.
Okay, so why would a person have the ability to speak in tongues there in the early church?
Again, it's a sign. It's something that had to come from God. They could, like you said, they hadn't studied it out. They didn't know the language, but they could speak to people.
Yeah, and specifically, who did it say it was for?
None.
Unbelievers.
The unbeliever. So how would a tongue be assigned to an unbeliever, or for the benefit of unbelievers? Versus prophecy, which he talks about benefits the whole church.
It's their attention.
Yeah, it gets their attention, and probably, now remember, some of these people would have been bilingual. I mean, they would have had the ability to speak more than one language. Paul is a good example of that, I think. But if somebody speaks to you in your native tongue, would that have made an impression on them?
Especially since these were Galileans, most of them.
Yeah,
Doing the speaking.
yeah,
When you go back to Acts chapter 2, they didn't just speak their language, they spoke their language in a way that they understood it.
yeah.
Like even the regional dialects or types of the way they would speak.
Yeah, and a lot of these places where we're reading about the church, for instance, like at Corinth, we're talking about a major city here, aren't we? We're not talking about Pottersville out here in the middle of nowhere where we all speak hillbilly. You know, it's not that everybody that would come in and out of that city could all speak and communicate the same way. And so I think the benefit that you had was for the unbelievers, and particularly if you had somebody visit. You know, you had the ability to speak to them like JD pointed out. People can speak two languages, but the best way to communicate with somebody is in their native language. That's where you're going to be the most effective. And so that again was an ability, but it was also a sign that these people had that ability, you know, not having studied. It wasn't something that they could just go around all day doing, was it? It was things that God blessed them with at particular times and particular moments, and especially if God had a message for a person. So, yeah, it does. One of the things that you would have to say in the early church, not everybody would have been bilingual. So if somebody, evidently, as we read through chapter 14 here, sometimes God would give them a message in an unknown tongue, wouldn't he? What do you have to have for the church to benefit from that?
Interpretation.
You had to have somebody interpret it, didn't you? You had to have somebody tell you, well, what is the meaning of this? Because not everybody knew that language. So it's, you know, you read through it here in chapter 14, there's some bits and pieces of it. And I think when you kind of put it together, you kind of get a more whole or complete picture here. But
Wasn't there also something to be said about the people who, the profiteers that would see things like this, they could realize, hey, if I just mumble something here, they'll think I've got, so it was another thing to shut them down too, because there was people doing that. We see, what's his name, and wanting to pay for the gift of the Holy Spirit. You know, there was profiteers at that time just like there is now. So you can speak in an unknown tongue. Well, look, he's got to be more godly than the rest of us.
yeah.
And so it was to shut them down too.
Yeah, well, they were, you know, the church at Corinth, obviously, they had a lot of different problems and reasons why they were divided, but one of them was their emphasis, I think, on speaking in tongues.
Yeah.
You know, they kind of viewed that, man, if you can speak in another tongue, you really got a gift. You know, you got an ability. And what Paul's talking about here in chapter 14 is he says, listen, nobody can understand you. It doesn't do any good at all. You know, God didn't give you this gift to stand up and show off in front of everybody. That's not the reason you have it. It's to benefit and edify the church. And so don't just use it to be using it. You know, if nobody's there that can tell the church what it means, then don't exercise it, don't use it. But what's kind of interesting, I think, is evidently what he talks about there, the person who spoke it understood what they were saying, didn't they? Because he said, you go ahead and do it in private between you and God. You know, if you're going to offer up a prayer, pray in an unknown tongue, if you don't have an interpreter present in the public, don't use it, but go ahead and use it in private. And that'll benefit you. You know, it'll help you, but it's not going to help anybody else. So just use it in a private way. So there's a lot of questions about these spiritual gifts that I have that I don't think the Bible gives us the answer to all of them, but they are kind of interesting when you read a chapter like this where these minor details kind of be brought out. But question number 7 was what had to be combined with the gift of tongues to make it useful? That's interpretation. So without somebody interpreting the message to the audience, wasn't going to do the church any good. Paul used some examples here in talking about, I put prophecy there, I was actually supposed to put tongues here. He used 3 different examples. He used an example of musical instruments, the military trumpet, and then speech. And he used those examples because we'll just take one for lack of time here. The military trumpet, you know, that was an important part in an army because the trumpeter signaled to the army what they were supposed to do. The sound of the trumpet, you know, there were different tones, there were different lengths, there were different numbers of sounds that were made, and they all signified to the army what they were supposed to do. So Paul says, what do you do if you have a trumpeter, and he's out here blowing on the trumpet, and you can't decipher what he's telling you? Is it going to do you any good? Well, that's what speaking in tongues without an interpreter was like in the early church. You know, the guy had the ability to sound the battle cry, but you couldn't understand what he was trying to tell you to do. So there was chaos. He talks about gifts that encourage the church. That's going to help them. That's one. All those gifts are going to help edify, build up the church. Were there any negatives? Question number 11 here. This is a good one, I think. Were there any negatives that came with speaking in tongues in the church assembly?
Nobody knew what was going on, they couldn't advance.
Yeah, this is again kind of paint the picture in your mind there in verse 23. He says, "Therefore, if the whole church comes together in one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those who are uninformed or unbelievers," there's your idea again, "will they not say that you are out of your mind?" I'm reading from the New King James Version here, but could you imagine that? I mean, if everybody in the church who had the ability to speak in a tongue, you know, this guy starts in over here, and then another guy starts in over here, and then somebody else starts here, and you have 4 or 5 guys who are speaking in different languages all at the same time, what would you think if you were a visitor?
Same thing there. He's visiting.
You think these guys are crazy, aren't they? And so that's part of what was going on, wasn't it? In the church at Corinth. Somebody had the ability to speak in tongues. Somebody else said, "I have that ability too, so I'll do it too." And then somebody else says, "I can't be left out. You know, I got to show my ability off too." So you have all these people speaking in tongues at the same time. It wasn't doing the church any good, was it? And it wasn't going to influence outsiders in a positive way either. And so, yeah, there were some negatives that came mainly with the abuse of using those tongues in the early church. So he talks about in the rest of the chapter there, you know, worship needs to be in an orderly manner. And what kind of order, kind of prophecy and tongues almost are the same thing, but what kind of order did Paul establish when it came to these gifts? What were some of the rules or regulations to be used?
No more than 2 or 3 speak.
Yeah, so in other words, what he's saying here is the whole church service wasn't supposed to be speaking in tongues, right? You got 2 or 3 guys, limit it to 2 or 3. What else did he say? Prophecy was the same way too, right? Wasn't just supposed to be prophecy the entire time during the church. He said, let it be 2 or 3. What else did he say? What other rules and regulations?
If there was no interpreter to keep silent.
Yeah, there's nobody to tell everyone what it means. You're not going to help anybody. So you just need to, you may have that gift and you may have that ability, but you just need to keep it to yourself. You know, don't display it in a public way because it's not going to help the early church. What about prophecy?
Same thing, verse 29. 2 or 3.
Yeah, and even this, Paul says, you know, first of all, you take a turn. Don't everybody stand up, not 2 or 3 at the same time. Everybody gets a turn. And if God reveals to one of the prophets something that needs to be added to what's being said, he needs to interrupt. He needs to say, wait a minute, you know, this is what God says, interject that into there, and go on in an orderly, established fashion. So you kind of had this idea, you know, you think about it, and that's what he's talking about. The spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets. In other words, you could control these miraculous gifts. You know, just because you had the ability to do this didn't mean you had to do it right then and there on the spot and open your mouth and say it. You had in the early church, they had the ability to control these gifts. So do it in an orderly fashion. Do it in an orderly manner. What about the role of women in the church? 14. Public assembly we're reading about, right?
Keeping silent.
Yeah, ask questions. You know, I wish we had more time to talk about that, but not the women, Dennis. The difference in probably one of their worship services and ours. Because when I picture the early church worship service, I think it was a lot more interactive and involved than ours is on a Sunday. There was a lot more discussion that took place rather than just lecturing. And you'll kind of see that throughout the pages of the Bible. But it wasn't uncommon for people to ask questions. You know, you're teaching about a subject here. It'd be a lot like one of our classes probably, but you're teaching about a subject here. Well, and even open it up. Say, you got anything you want to add? You want to say? Wasn't uncommon for multiple men to stand up and talk about this particular subject. So But not the role of women in the public assembly, was it? And so if they had a question, Paul said, you know, don't stand up in the public and start lecturing or asking questions. You learn that in private. So what's the conclusion here regarding the worship service in the church that Paul comes to? Question 15.
Let all things be done decently.
Decently and orderly, right? Does that mean stiff and cold? What does that mean, decently and orderly? What's interesting when you read about this particular setting, was there flexibility in this? Was there flexibility in the order of the worship service? Was there any spontaneous things that happened?
Sure.
Yeah. But they were done in a decently and orderly fashion, weren't they? And so it doesn't necessarily mean stiff and cold and rigid, you know, or kind of this boundary or these lines that are drawn with, you know, set in stone, so to speak. But anything that's done within that worship service was to be done in a decently and an orderly fashion. And goes back to the first question. You know, if we're going to accomplish what we need to accomplish, there has to be order, doesn't there? And so it wasn't happening in Corinth, something that they needed to fix. All right, so we're out of time. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, questions? I know these are, when you cover these chapters, you just got to blaze through them and kind of pick up the main ideas from them. Hopefully you can go home and figure out a little bit more on our own, though. Anybody else?
What about the beginning of 13? I know we're going back here. What is the significance when he says, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels"?
Yeah.
I think that the holiness people kind of get hung up on that speaking of the tongues of angels.
Yeah.
Why did Paul say of angels?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You know, this is one of those weird questions, but when we imagine, or when I imagine God speaking, I always hear English, don't you? What do you think? What do you think somebody in a different nation hears? Not going to be English, is it? Is there a language, a spiritual language? Probably. Do we speak it? I doubt it. But yeah, yeah. But there is some kind of designation in the men and the angels, wouldn't you think?
Wasn't Paul permitted, he didn't actually say he was permitted to know and see things unseen from men. He talks about it. I wondered if that might be somewhat what he's talking about in angels.
Yeah, there's, you know, in whether that was a vision or whatever, there were some things that he saw and heard that he wasn't allowed to repeat when he came back, but yeah. I don't know. I'm really, I mean, obviously there's some kind of language that's used in heaven to communicate. I don't know. I don't think it's English or any other language we use here on the earth, but I haven't really thought about it that deeply. I will, though. I'll go home and study it some more. Anybody else?